across the wide plains of Meadowbrook Ranch, carrying the smell of an earth and dust. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden hue over the land, making the white fence and posts sparkle as if they were standing in watch over the vast expanse. And for Alanina Hartwell, the view from her kitchen window had once been a source of peace, a refuge where she could escape in the noise of the world. But now at 42, and it felt more like a gilded cage. Her and husband Charles had been the one to bring this ranch to life, building it into a fortune worth millions. Cattle and oil wells and real estate. Their lives had been filled with luxury, comfort, and instability. Yet since Charles's tragic death in a riding accident 3 months ago, nothing about the ranch felt like home. The riches that had once provided everything she could ever want and now seemed hollow, a cold reminder of the man she'd lost. And Alanina stared out the window, trying to find some sort of comfort in the view, but it was impossible. The bed in her room was still too big, still too empty. Her mind wandered to the plans she discussed with the lawyers to sell the ranch, to get out of this place that had been built with so many dreams. And now just an empty reminder of what she once had. The soft crunch of boots on and the front porch jolted her back to reality. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the nearest neighbor was miles away, and Alanina's heart skipped a beat as she moved toward the door. Through the lace and curtains, she saw a towering figure standing outside. She opened the door slowly, and before her stood a giant of a man, at least 6'8" tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to block out the sun. His face was weathered, marked by years of hard labor under the unforgiving Montana sun. His clothes were worn, faded denim shirt, dusty jeans, and boots that had seen better days. He removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair that fell in waves around his face. "Mom, my name's Jake Sullivan," he said in a deep, growly voice. "I heard about your husband's passing and I need work." Alanina hesitated. She didn't know this man, and she certainly didn't want strangers on her property. But something in his voice made her pause, a rawness, and vulnerability that she couldn't ignore. And for a moment, her instincts screamed to shut the door to stay safe. But the words on his lips made her stay put. "I'm sorry," she said, her hand still resting on the doorframe. "But I'm not hiring right now. I'm actually considering selling the ranch." Jake's face faltered, his broad chest rising and falling with the breath he was holding. For a moment, he looked like a lost child, a giant man suddenly diminished by the weight of desperation. "Please, ma'am," he pleaded, voice thick and with emotion. "I've been out of work for 2 months. Lost my job at the Henderson Ranch when they shut down. I got nowhere else to go. I can do anything. Work in cattle, fix fences, handle equipment, and I'm strong. I'm reliable. I don't cause trouble. I just need a chance." Lana studied his face, seeing the genuine desperation behind his words. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched his hat, and there was vulnerability in his green eyes that made her rethink her decision. "Where have you been staying?" she asked, more out of curiosity than concern. Jake shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. "Been sleeping in my truck mostly. Sometimes the shelter in Billings when it gets too cold," quote, and the words hit her like a punch to the stomach. She had imagined many things, but the idea of this giant of a man sleeping in his truck was something she hadn't expected. She had money, a vast fortune at her fingertips, and here was a man who needed help not just for work but for survival. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sullivan, but I really can't." Alanina began to shut the door, but then Jake did something that made her freeze in her tracks. He dropped to one knee. The sight of this giant, rugged man kneeling before her like a night in a time long past shocked her into silence. His eyes were filled with pleading desperation. "Please, Mom, I'm begging you, I'll work for half wages, just room and board. I'll prove myself." Alanina stood frozen for a long moment, her heart racing in her chest. Everything in her wanted to say no, to turn him away, to stay safe. But the sight of this man humbling himself so completely, so desperately, tugged at something deep inside her. "Get up," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "Please, just get up." Jake rose slowly, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to. I just don't know what else to do." Lanana's heart wavered. This wasn't just about needing work. It was about survival, about the fear that came from not knowing where your next meal or place to sleep would come from. She fought with herself weighing the decision in her mind, the warning bells ringing loudly. Every part of her said not to let him in. But in that moment, the loneliness she felt and the kindness she saw in his eyes shifted something inside her. "There's a bunkin' house," she said reluctantly. "Hasn't been used in 2 years. so it'll probably need cleaning. If you want to stay there and for a few days while you look for other and work, I suppose that would be and acceptable. Jake's eyes lit up, and Alanana couldn't help but feel a small and pang of guilt for not having done more, and he nodded eagerly, a huge grin spreading and across his face. Thank you, ma'am. Thanking you so much. I promise I won't let you in down. As Jake walked toward the old bunkin' house, Alanina stood on her porch and watching him go. He was a giant of a man, but in that moment he seemed so and much smaller, carrying the weight of his in desperation on his shoulders, and she closed the door behind her. But as she locked it, a thought crossed her mind. Had she just made a mistake in letting him stay? The next few days would tell. Over the next week, Jake proved to be everything he had promised, and Lelanina watched from her kitchen window, and as he worked tirelessly on the ranch and repairing fences, cleaning out the barn, and in even fixing the stubborn water pump and that had been a thorn in her side for months. His work ethic was undeniable, and in his size, which once intimidated in her, became a welcome sight when she saw and how he moved with surprising grace and skill. But as the days passed, something else began to stir inside Alanina. It wasn't just his strength that caught her attention, it was his presence, and every time she saw him without his shirt, sweat glistening on his muscular back under the hot sun, she felt an unfamiliar flutter in her chest, and his broad frame and raw energy seemed to fill the space around her. And each time their eyes met, it was hard for her to look away, and she hadn't expected this attraction, and to a man who was a stranger to her. And man who had come to her door begging for work. She hadn't felt anything like this since Charles's death, and the guilt that followed made her pull away. But it didn't stop the stirring inside her. One evening, as the sun began to dip behind in the hills, Jake knocked on her door. His hat was in his hand as usual, and there was a faint look of apprehension on his face. Mrs. Hart, well, he began, his voice warm but uncertain. I wanted to thank you again for letting me stay. I know it's been a week and I don't want to overstay my welcome. Alanina had been expecting this conversation. Though she had grown accustomed to his presence on the ranch, she knew that eventually he would need to leave. He needed to find work, and she needed to move on with her life. But when she looked at him standing there, tall and strong yet invulnerable, she wasn't sure how to proceed. Have you found other work? And she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Jakey's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening slightly. I've applied at every ranch within 50 miles. Most won't even see me once they hear. I don't have references from my last job. Why don't you have references? Lanina asked, and sensing the discomfort in his voice, and Jake shifted, his gaze dropping to the ground for a moment. When he spoke again, his words were measured as though he were picking them carefully. And there was an incident, nothing illegal. But the rancher's daughter took a liking to me, and her father didn't appreciate it. Quote, Elenina's heart tightened, and a flash of jealousy rising within her at the mention of another woman. What happened? She asked, trying to keep her emotions in check. Jake's expression became hard. She made advances. I turned her down, but her husband caught her trying to kiss me in the barn. And it looked bad. Lenina could see the hurt behind the anger in his eyes. So, and you were fired for something you didn't do, she asked, her voice soft with sympathy. Jake gave a bitter laugh. Story of my life. Being this size, and people always assume the worst. They think I'm aggressive or dangerous and that I take what I want. The truth is, I just work hard and try to stay out of trouble. Lenina's chest tightened as she saw the pain in his eyes. She knew what it felt like to be judged. People always had their opinions about her marriage to Charles, about her wealth and her life, but Jake's pain was different. He had spent his life being misunderstood and pushed aside because of his size and reputation. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. You don't seem dangerous to me, she said quietly, and Jake's green eyes met hers, and for a moment the air between them felt thick and with something unspoken. His gaze lingered on her for a beat too long, and Lelanina felt her heart race. What if there was another way? Jake asked, and suddenly, his voice low and tentative, and Lelanina blinked, taken off guard by the question. What do you mean? Jake took a deep breath. Then to her shock, he knelt down before her again, this time and with an even deeper desperation in his eyes. Stay, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Let me stay and work for you. I'll do whatever it takes. I can help with the ranch, with the cattle. I'll work harder than anyone, and I'll prove that I'm worth it. Please give me a chance. I can make things right. Alina felt her breath catch in her throat. The man she had only known for a week was kneeling before her and begging for a chance, offering everything he had in a way no one had ever done for her. She looked down at him, torn between fear and something else she couldn't name. Her mind raced, and he was asking for more than just a job, and he was asking for trust, for an opportunity to prove himself. She knew, and this wasn't just about work, it wasn't about survival. And there was something raw in Jake's plea that made her realize how deeply he needed this. Her heart softened, but her mind told her to be cautious. Jake, she trailed off and unsure of how to respond. She was a widow, still grieving, and she knew when people would talk. The last thing she needed was gossip about her hiring a man like Jake Sullivan, who already had a reputation. Jake stood slowly, his face filled with both hope and fear. "You don't have to decide now," he said quietly. "I'll be here working hard and until you've made up your mind." For the first time since Charles's death, and Elenina felt the weight in her chest lift just a little. There was something about Jake's presence, something about his vulnerability that made her feel less alone. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Jake smiled, a smile so genuine and full of relief that it made Elenina's heart ache. "Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for at least considering it." As he walked back to the bunkhouse, Elenina stood on the porch watching him go. For the first time in months, she didn't feel the overwhelming loneliness of the ranch, but a new feeling stirred in her chest, and one that she wasn't ready to face. Wasn't she really ready to let him stay, to let him into her life, or was this just another mistake waiting to happen? The days that followed felt like a delicate and balancing act for Ellie and Anna. Jake threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, repairing fences, tending to the cattle, and tackling tasks around the ranch that had been neglected for too long. Alana found herself watching him more often than she cared to admit, her eyes tracing the way he moved effortlessly strong yet gentle with every task he took on. Her feelings for him had only grown since he first stepped onto the ranch. She was drawn to him in a way she hadn't expected, her attraction to him building like a slow and undeniable tide. But with each passing day, a war waged inside her. She couldn't ignore the pull between them, but she also couldn't let herself act on it. Not when her heart still bore the weight of Charles's memory. And one evening, as they sat on the porch in the bunkhouse sharing a quiet dinner of stew and cornbread, Elenina felt the tension between them reach a breaking point. The golden light of the setting sun bathed the landscape, casting long shadows across the ranch. The air was thick with the unspoken words hanging in between them. Jake sat down a spoon and turned to her, his green eyes intense. "And you've been kind to me, Mrs. Hartwell, and more than I deserve." Alina felt her heart quicken at the sound of her name on his lips. "You've earned it," she replied softly, unable to tear her gaze away from him. Jake shifted in his seat, his broad shoulders tensing. "And I never expected this. Never expected someone to see me for more than just my size or my reputation, but you did. And I can't thank you enough for that." And Elenina's breath hitched in her chest. She didn't want to hear the words she knew were coming next. She didn't want to face the truth that was slowly creeping into her heart, but it wasn't already there, unspoken, but impossible to ignore. Jake leaned forward, his face so close to hers that she could feel the heat of his breath. "I want to be here. I want to stay, and I want to prove to you that I'm worth it." Elenina swallowed hard, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. Her mind screamed at her to stop and to draw the line, to maintain the boundary she had set. But her heart was already gone. She had already let him in, whether she was ready to admit it or not. "And Jake," she began, but her words caught in her throat before she could finish, and Jake placed a hand over hers, his touch surprisingly gentle yet firm. "I'm not asking for anything, Mrs. Hartwell. I'm just asking for a chance." Her pulse raced as she looked into his eyes seeing the raw sincerity in his expression. "I'm not ready," she whispered more to herself than to him. And Jake nodded slowly, his eyes sad but understanding. "I know," he said softly, "but you'll get there. You'll be ready, and when you're ready." It was a simple statement, but it held more weight than Elenina could bear. She felt the walls she had built around her heart begin to crumble piece by piece. And when Jake pulled her hand into his held it, there Elenina didn't pull away, the next few weeks felt like a blur. They continued their daily routine with Jake working the ranch and Elenina managing the business side of things. They had dinner together almost every night, and sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about everything and nothing. But something had shifted between them, a new understanding, a new closeness. And one rainy Thursday, Elenina returned from town after a meeting with her lawyer. She was tired, emotionally drained, and not in the mood for company. But when she entered the house, she found Jake standing in the kitchen soaked to the bone, shivering. "What had happened?" she asked, rushing to get him in a towel. "The roof's leaking in the bunkin' house," Jake said through chattering and teeth. "I've been trying to fix it, but the rain's coming down too hard," and Elenina's heart acted at the sight of him standing there, drenched and exhausted without a second thought. She pulled him inside and wrapped a towel around his shoulders. "You can't stay out there tonight," she said firmly. "And you'll get sick." Jake hesitated and looking uncomfortable. "I'm fine, Mrs. Hartwell. I don't want to cause any trouble." "No," Elenina insisted, her voice soft but firm. "You'll stay here. I have a guest room." Jake looked at her for a long moment, his expression torn between ingratitude and hesitation. "And I don't think that's a good idea," he murmured. "Why not?" Alela asked her, frustration creeping into her voice, and Jake hesitated before speaking, his voice low. "Because I'm in love with you," and Elenina froze, her breath catching in her throat. The words hung in the air and like a heavy weight, their truth and undeniable, and she hadn't expected this confession. Not from him, not from anyone, not now. "And Jake," she whispered, taking a step back and her heart racing. "This can't happen." And quote, Jake's face fell, but he stepped in closer, his voice pleading. "I know it's complicated. I know I'm not what you're used to, but I love you. I've loved you, and from the moment you gave me a chance. And I can't pretend anymore." Elenina's mind spun. She had spent months denying her feelings, pretending that she was still grieving, pretending that she wasn't drawn to him. But now, with him standing before her, so vulnerable and so real, she couldn't deny it any longer. "I can't do this," she whispered again, but this time her voice cracked and with the weight of her own emotions. And Jake dropped to his knee before her, his eyes shining with sincerity. "Please," and he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and I'm not asking for your heart right now, just for a chance. Let me stay. Let me work for you. Let me prove that I can and make you happy. I can even and get you pregnant again." The words hung in the air, raw and real, and Elenina felt a wave of shock and emotion crash over her. She stared at the man before her, this giant who had come to her doorstep, desperate and broken, and saw, and not just a stranger, but someone who had offered everything he had, his love, his loyalty, his devotion. And in that moment, Elenina knew that her life had changed forever. "Get up," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake rose slowly, his face a mix of hope and uncertainty. Alolan's hands shook as she reached for him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "Yes," she said softly, and her voice full of certainty. "Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I want this. I want you." And in that moment, the weight of the past was lifted, and Elenina realized that love, real, honest love, was worth everything she had been afraid of. She had found a future in the arms of a man who had nothing to lose but everything to give. As they stood there holding each other, Elenina knew that this was just the beginning of their story, and whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The lonely widow and the desperate cowboy had found their way to each other, and together they would build a life that neither of them had ever expected.